are few this morning. Pat is going to record the meeting and make it available on YouTube. So watch your emails.
And cross your fingers.
Yeah, cross your fingers. But it should be a good bit easier for her and us and you guys on YouTube according to what her thoughts are. So we'll see how that goes. Other than that, stay warm. We have set the thermostat up. And we're off and running. Thank you very much for coming out. Jim?
Paul, thank you. And in our continuing effort to have a multi-state audience, I'd like to also welcome the Pancratz family, Mary and Bob. There's Mary, there's Bob, yeah. Mary and Bob from the great state of Wisconsin are joining us today. And Jim and Donna. Jim is just back from Wisconsin himself. So the other thing on the YouTube that we're trying to do is, and our audience varies. It's slowly getting bigger, but it varies. And also we have several members now who've got to a point where they really have health or mobility issues. We also have, I had a call from a member last week, long time, never missed member who is now living in New York in a assisted care facility. He said, gee, I really would like to still take part. So this is our effort to see if we can broaden it to current and past members of the History Club to assist their things. If you're wondering, Paul, if you're wondering, this gift to me today, this is sand from Normandy.
Omaha Beach.
Oh, Omaha Beach.
Omaha Beach.
To be particular, Omaha Beach, one of the 5 beaches. So thank you. Hallowed ground. We're going to pick up a little bit where we left off last time. You may remember we were in the post-World War II era. It was the 1945, 46, 47 period. And we didn't talk a lot about domestic politics and doings. We'll talk about that some today. And we also had just started to talk about kind of the signature moment, and when you look for where did the Cold War begin? A lot of people think the Cold War really began probably when Stalin and Truman and Winston Churchill and then his successor Clement Attlee met for the last time in the summit. Others point to other points. Berlin Airlift is often a marker at the beginning of the Cold War. We've just begun to talk about that. We'll talk about that a bit more today as well. So let's try to get our heads back into 1946, 1947. People are coming home from the war. The annual popularity poll shows that the most popular man in America is Bing Crosby. The second, by the way, this poll has been done every year for decades by then. Second most popular person in the country, American in the country, was for the first time a black man. It was Jackie Robinson, who had broken segregated Major League Baseball just that very year. Germany, of course, in foreign affairs, Germany is a tremendous focus. And I have to do this, right? Yeah. Again, I'll be a revolving door today, I guess. A reminder of World War II, already by 45, you can see the nations that are beginning to, or have already become Soviet occupied, represented by the Red Army. And you can see much of Eastern Europe. When the war was over, Stalin did not pull his troops out. He left them where they were, or advanced further west in some cases. And so you begin to see already a division between East and West in Germany, between Soviet-controlled or dominated nations and those that were in the loose Western alliance. And a reminder that the agreement made between Stalin, Attlee, and Truman had been that when the war was over, now the war is over, that we will at least temporarily partition, divide up Germany. In this case, you have the Soviet Union is obviously in the red, Army Clever is in the red, and I think I'm going to take this off, and you also have the Allied sector, France, that doesn't really ever do much. See memo on that, yeah. Britain and the United States. And of course, the most important point is that look where Berlin is. All of Berlin. All of Berlin is in the Sea of Red. All of Berlin is in the Soviet sector, supposedly the temporary Soviet sector of Germany, of post-war Germany. On June the 5th of 45, which when you think about it, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, so it's very soon after VE Day. The Allied Control Council, called the ACC, we know the ACC for something else around here, was formed. Each of these four Allied powers were members of the ACC. And Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower sent, oh, by the way, sent Lucius Clay, who was his aide, deputy, had worked heavily in the area of logistics during the Second World War, to negotiate with the Allied Control Council. He'll eventually become part of it, to make sure we had adequate access between what became the eastern and western portions of the partitioned Germany. This is General Lucius Clay. Again, he will go on to become the most important figure in not just the western sector, but eventually, by 48, 49, the western sector, French, Britain, and American, will become West Germany. It will become consolidated. Clay is basically the man who was picked by Truman on the recommendation of General Eisenhower to lead up those efforts. Again, he's very aware that Berlin is 110 miles within Soviet territory. So one of the key things that he tries to negotiate with the Soviet occupation forces is access to Berlin. Again, it's 110 miles. It's 110 miles inside the Soviet sector, and grudgingly, really, the Soviets agreed that they'll let there be limited rail and road access in and out of the Soviet sector to get to the American sector, the western sector of West Berlin. This is the Allied Control Council. It's actually the second one. The first one included Clay, but the second one, again, representatives of the four nations. Brigadier General Howley, who was nicknamed among his men was Howling Mad Howley, was very tough from the beginning, very skeptical of the Soviet Union's intentions in Germany. And another figure that's interesting is next to him in this depiction is General Kordakov, who is not only at that time the Soviet representative, but his main job is kidnapping and spiriting German scientists out of the country back to the Soviet Union. Now, we were doing the same thing, but in our case, most of the people were folks like Werner von Braun, who were happy to surrender to the Western or American forces. Most of the ones who made it to the Soviet Union were under these efforts were kidnapped and taken to the Soviet Union, often without their families. But again, we have one highway, one railway access to inside the Soviet sector to get to Berlin. The other key point, keep in mind about what's going to build into a huge crisis is the air corridors. There were three, again, this is part of the written agreement in 45 between the four occupying powers, was that the French, the Americans, and the British could have air access into Berlin through 3 points. Each was 20 miles wide, each of those three corridors, 20 miles wide, and they had to be below 10,000 feet. So again, limited air access as well, but again, very quickly, very strongly supervised. Maybe most importantly, this is, by the way, General Howley again. Most importantly is probably this man. This is Walter Ulbricht, U-L-B-R-I-C-H-T. Not a warm and fuzzy person. His view of Berlin, as he summarized to his people, his cadre, was it's got to look, meaning post-war Germany, especially the areas controlled by the Soviet Union, quote, it's got to look democratic, but we must have everything in our control. He's very much a product of the Soviet Union. He's very much the man that Joseph Stalin wanted in Berlin. And he's really a spy, and his number one position is to seize control of as much of the city of Berlin as he could. For example, one of his very first acts was to have Soviet soldiers seize control of the police forces it's in the Soviet sector. And also, unlike in the American, French, British sectors, the Soviets were carting out of what we think of as East Germany and back to the Soviet Union anything that was not nailed down. And all kinds of equipment, large equipment, machinery, tools. If it hadn't been destroyed by the war and they could move it, it was being moved back into the Soviet Union. From the largest sort of things that shipped to the smallest. It was open season in what became East Berlin and East Germany for anything they could cart off. Ulbricht, by the way, is one of those figures who will be around forever. He, without having the title most of the time of president or chancellor, he is the man in East Berlin and East Germany. He'd been a member what is in fact the German Communist Party since 1919, which means that their formation was in 1919. He spent most of the Second World War in Moscow, not in Germany, and then Stalin sent him back right after the war ended as his man. And to show you how long Ulbricht lasted, he was uncontested the power broker, the center of power in East Berlin and East Germany until 1971, when he was finally persuaded to give up the reins. And he is the man, we're talking about 46, 47, he is the man who went to Nikita Khrushchev in 1961 and said, "You've got to let me build a wall." He's the man who came up with the concept. We're bleeding everybody who has an education or skills. They're fleeing East Berlin for West Berlin. And it was Ulbricht who came up with the idea of persuading Nikita Khrushchev to put up the Berlin Wall in 1961. That is longevity. Here's another typically well-focused, well-defined photograph from the Eastern Bloc, and this is 47 or 48. No, it's 49. It's 49, and you can see Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and next to him is Ulbricht, Walter Ulbricht. So he traveled in that kind of company. By let's say by the middle to late 1945 into 46, we also had the situation that Berlin, East and West, has really ceased to function. Electricity, basic power, water that you could drink, you name it, didn't exist. Transportation was very precarious. Almost any building of any consequence or size we'd long since bombed during the war. This is a picture of a young boy trying to grow a little vegetable garden, and that's in West Berlin. And again, something must be done because people are starving. So again, Lucius Clay, Ike's deputy. Also, very importantly, he was a close friend of Jimmy Burns, who would soon be Secretary of State for Harry Truman, Byrnes. We've mentioned him many times. He's the former governor of South Carolina. Nobody's perfect. And had run the Office of War Mobilization. Clay had worked for him there, and now Clay is being sent as the numero uno for the Western, at least the American powers in Berlin. He is, by the way, he becomes tremendously important in the future of Berlin and of West Germany generally. He never had a military command in combat in the Second World War. His field was logistics. His field was getting stuff from point A to point B. In many ways, kind of an ideal background for trying to rebuild West Berlin in particular, and also West Germany. And right from the very beginning, while he was trying to be conciliatory to the Soviets, there were clashes. Marshal Zhukov, Z-H-U-K-O-V, you may remember, was one of the famous Soviet generals of the Second World War. Marshal Zhukov, for a brief time, headed up Soviet forces officially in East Berlin and East Germany. And it was he who was trying to make any kind of cooperation with the West as difficult as possible. So almost in the very beginning, Zhukov and Clay had crashed. But in spite of that, not everybody thinks alike, not even everybody in the same delegation. And in the beginning, Lucius Clay, military man as he is, really seemed to think maybe we can get along with the Soviets. Maybe we can finesse our difficulties in terms of sharing resources or having access to Berlin. Maybe we can reason with them. If Stalin and Attlee and Truman can meet and put out these statements, we're still at war and we're all pals. Maybe we can work on Zhukov and his successors. And also keep in mind the size of Berlin. It's contested how many people were in Berlin in this post-war period, but it's about 3 million. Again, showing you the devastation of the war, that we're down to about 3 million people in Berlin, of which about 2 million are in the western sectors, France, United States, Great Britain. So it's not, it's a much diminished Berlin, east and west in population. Numbers are very hard to get your hands around because, again, people are in transit. There are millions of displaced persons throughout Europe. There are people who don't have homes, who are traveling from country to country looking for assistance. There are survivors of the Holocaust who are in various locations, including Germany. It goes on and on. There's a lot of flux in the population of Europe generally, and certainly of Germany. Yes.
How does that compare to the pre-war Berlin, such as the Weimar population?
Oh, it was, I want to say 30, 40 million.
30 to 40
For the country.
For the country, yeah, for the country.
Okay, yeah, right.
For the country itself, before the beginning of the Second World War. So you can see how rapidly it had diminished. The other thing too, when it looked like that Hitler was going to lose, any German with any sense tried to get out of Berlin, and some did obviously. Is that answering your question?
Yes.
The effort, again, to try to get along, it's a part of the early post-war German history I don't think people understand. Now, people like General Howley were, from the beginning, can't trust those SOBs. I think that's the quote. He never trusted the Soviet occupiers of East Berlin, East Germany. But Clay really did seem to come in. And he also had instructions. He had instructions from the President, Truman, from the Secretary of State, Harry Burns. Here they are in a lighter moment in 1945. And I guess, that's Truman on the left.
Right.
And
On the right.
well, on the right, actually. That's true. And Truman's instructions through Burns to Clay had been, we are determined that we will get along with the Soviets in any way that we can. And Truman and Burns also told Clay, you occupy the testing ground of international cooperation. So if we are able to tamp down the strains, the tension between the Soviet Union and the United States and its Western allies, you're the testing ground. We're going to find out in Germany whether or not it is possible. Years later, and by the way, I love this photograph of the time, the Soviet bear happened to have his arms around what? Access to Berlin. Years later, in retirement, General Clay, Lucius Clay, reflected back on this time. And this is Lucius Clay talking when he's retired. I think it's about 61, 62. And in an interview with the Truman Library, General Clay said, "After all, we had spent a couple of years convincing everybody what a wonderful thing it was that we and the Russians were fighting together." Closing years of the Second World War. How overnight could we turn around and convince people, meaning the American people, Western European people, that the Soviets were a threat to our national security? It was a very difficult thing to do at that time. If the Russians had not taken the steps they did, meaning occupation of Eastern Europe, meaning being truculent in Berlin, I don't know that we would have done it. That is, changed public opinion in America. If they, the Soviets, Stalin, had been more subtle, they might indeed have gained all of Western Europe before we realized what was happening. I think that's quite a statement looking back. He said, if they hadn't been so obvious, the Soviets might have gained even more nations and territory than they could have hoped. One thing you gotta give Lucius Clay, a lot of credit for is he also realized that the real goal here is to economically revitalize Western Europe. Western Europe devastated by the Second World War, and that you weren't going to be able to revitalize the economy of Western Europe if you didn't also revitalize the economy of Western Germany. Hopefully all of Germany, but at least the western sectors of Germany. That Germany was simply too important in this post-Nazi defeated period to leave it a basket case. And again, in 61, General Clay says in the interview with the Truman Library, "My interest in having a revived Western Europe came from my realization that we could not have an economic recovery in Germany unless it was done as part of all of Western Europe." It was about this time that the Congressional Committee came over studying the Marshall Plan. We'll talk more about the Marshall Plan probably next time. The Herter Committee came over. H-E-R-T-E-R. We preached this to the committee at the time. Again, if you're gonna have revitalization, Germany has to be part of it, at least Western Germany. As a matter of fact, one of the members of that committee, the Herter Committee, who spent a whole month in Germany at the time, was Everett Dirksen, then a congressman, member of the House. He came back a very strong supporter of an economic program that would apply to all of Western Europe, including West Germany. I like to put a face with a name, so this so you know, this is Christian Herter, congressman at the time, later governor of Massachusetts. He's heading up the Herter Committee that's investigating what is the situation in Europe, and in particular situation in Germany and in Berlin. Christian Herter has he's one of those people who was very influential in foreign affairs for this country in the late 40s and the 50s, even into the 60s, and yet today, does anybody know his name? Okay, Bill knows his name.
Because he's from Massachusetts area.
Yeah.
And he was governor of Massachusetts.
What's with the fish?
Wasn't he also Secretary of State?
Yes,
Right?
yes, good, exactly as I asked you to prompt me. When John Foster Dulles himself dies in 1959, and he's Secretary of State for Eisenhower, when he dies, Christian Herter becomes Secretary of State. So he is Eisenhower's Secretary of State for the last roughly 2 years of his 8-year administration. You're exactly right. He has another claim to fame. This Herter Committee, it was Republicans and Democrats. They were going around, again, checking on the situation. It wasn't a junket. They actually took it very seriously. He has senior and younger members of the Congress, and one of the young members, freshman members, in the Herter Committee that went around Europe, was fascinated even then by Christian Herter's, he was also in the State Department in that period, by his knowledge of foreign affairs and his knowledge of the players and the political leaders, the labor leaders, what have you in the various countries. He seemed to know them all by their first name. And this young congressman became so caught up in Christian Herter's off-the-cuff tutorials that he said, well, if I remain in public life, my focus is going to be on foreign relations. This is really interesting. And the young congressman was Richard Nixon. So Christian Herter did a lot to shape what would become the lifelong focus of Richard Nixon, which is interesting. At least I think it's interesting. And by the way, I mentioned Herter has a point of saying Everett Dirksen. We think today of the Senate office building, the Dirksen office building. We think of the Ev Dirksen with that deep voice he had from the 50s and 60s. We think of the Ev Dirksen who was instrumental in helping Lyndon Johnson pass the Civil Rights Act of '64. Well, this is Ev Dirksen. This happens to be 52, and he's a congressman running successfully, as it will turn out, for the U.S. Senate. In fact, he's running against, he has no chance, he's running against the Senate Majority Leader, a man of Illinois, a man named Scott Lucas, and Dirksen at the 52 convention. Dirksen will beat him. And as they say, the rest is history. But again, I think it's always fun to go back. People weren't always, didn't always look like they looked when they were
Really?
65. But nonetheless, by 1947, it's pretty obvious, this cartoon isn't far off. The Soviet Union, Stalin had very successfully kept the troops in occupied territories in Eastern Europe. He was, as quickly as he could, forming quote-unquote coalition governments between communist and democratic forces that very quickly became communist nations. There was no real power sharing. And he is, as this cartoon implies, how far will he go? It's a question that General Clay raised in the quote I gave you a moment ago. Is he going to want all of Germany? What about France? There's a lot of political upheaval in France.
Finland.
What about Finland? Exactly. Yes.
Jim?
Oh, I'm sorry.
About 2 slides ago, you showed a time cover with the fish on it.
Yeah, what was the fish all
What
about?
was the significance of the fish?
Cod, governor of Massachusetts.
Cod wars with Iceland.
See, I knew that somebody would ask me that, so I looked it up. It's cod. And I guess that's the Boston insurance building, maybe. Pardon me? Yeah, that's, oh yeah, of course. And you see the state capitol down the corner. Yeah, it's cod.
He mentioned also the cod wars with Finland. Was it Finland?
Iceland.
Iceland.
Iceland, yeah. That's exactly right.
I have a question.
Yes,
This is
please.
the second map you've shown that shows a portion of Austria, anywhere from a third to a half,
Mhm.
to be in the Soviet sector. Was that a line of partition, or did most of that territory come back to,
It was up for grabs.
yeah.
At this point in time, it was up for grabs. Certainly Stalin would like to have had a Soviet satellite, the Soviet satellites include Austria, but it was there were many people in Austria who did not share that opinion, and it was considered up for grabs at that time. I think, it's under the category of countries under strong Soviet political pressure.
No, it's the one
No,
above it.
it's beyond that. Communist or communist influenced governments. So it would have been a coalition government. If that answers your question. The other point to keep in mind too is that, there was a lot of information was very here and there and everywhere. We often didn't know what was going on exactly in various countries, because if Stalin had enough control in that country, little things like a free press were being shut down. In addition to all this, we're going to come back to this country for a moment. We'll come back to Berlin, the Berlin Airlift, but we shouldn't forget that where the American people are focused. And the American people really aren't focused on Berlin. I mean, they're concerned, I guess, but what they're really focused on is getting back to civilian life, having babies, buying homes, dealing with the post-war economy best they could, buying a car, so forth. And so 1946 is, I think, aptly named in this book, the year of indecision, tour through the crucible of Harry Truman's America. Harry Truman's America in 1946 was, for Harry Truman, not a very happy time. When he had become president, April the 12th of 1945, few would have predicted what a political liability he would become to the Democratic Party within about a year. A Gallup poll taken, of course, people rally around a new president, especially in the time of a president's death and then his successor. And when Harry Truman moved up to the presidency in April of 45, polls were showing, were showing that his popularity was around 87%.
Great.
That's pretty good. It's pretty good. In modern polling, we only have had one president, by the way, who ever registered more than 87% at any time of his presidency. Anyone know who it is? FDR is a good guess. Reagan's a good guess. It's George Bush 41. The father, Desert Storm. And in 1991, his popularity rating after Desert Storm hit 91%. The next year, he was kicked out of office.
So what'd you do today?
That's right. American people can be fickle. In spite of that high rating initially, for Truman, it didn't last. At one point in 1946, we were seeing flour shortages. We were seeing long bread lines. We were seeing pictures that reminded everyone of the Great Depression. We were seeing a scarcity of products. Again, everything had been converted to the war effort, and converting back from making tanks or aircraft to making automobiles or this new washing machine gadget. It didn't happen overnight. In effect, you had too much money chasing too few goods, too few Chevys, too few nylons, too few beefsteaks, you name it. And to top it off, a lot of people don't remember or know that in the immediately post-war years was a period of strikes, labor strikes. Organized labor was probably no more powerful, perhaps, than it was in this period, nor seldom were they more discontented. Now, first of all, why would we have all the labor strikes when the war was over? Well, we'd had wartime price controls on wages, on prices of all kinds. Unions were part of that, except for John L. Lewis of the steel workers who tried to buck the trend. But unions generally had abided by wartime price controls, and now it was time to make up with higher wages, better benefits, and why can't we do this now, not tomorrow? Give you an example. In '46, we had 116 million man hours of labor lost. 116 million man hours of labor lost to strikes. That's 3 times the number of people out on strike than in any year in American history. We still had price controls in this country. We had the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, headed by Chester Bowles, and their efforts to control prices in the face of all these strikes and demands for higher wages was being shredded. In November of '45, the automobile makers went on strike. They had a walkout at General Motors, which probably richly deserved some protest. Their walkout at GM lasted for 113 days. So at the very time, again, you're trying to convert back to a peacetime economy, we have this 113-day strike in General Motors. They finally got wage and price benefit increase of a then whopping 18.5 cents an hour. In February of 1946, something even more dramatic happens. 46 brings us at the beginning of the year 750,000 steel workers who go out on strike. The 140, that's what, 3/4 million? I know that most of the headline is tough to see, but a couple of things that caught my eye. Railroad strike ties up nation. Truman on radio at 10 o'clock tonight on the crisis. How many are out in St. Louis? President going on the air after conferring with labor leaders. He had tried to talk them out of going on strike. They told him to pound sand, basically. And you can see it's huge news. If I showed you the New York Times about the same time, it will say within a couple of days, nation's economy in paralysis. So again, the steel workers strike on top of the others is a big deal. Now, what does Harry Truman, what does President Truman do? And in this case, this is the one that seems to set him off. Harry Truman, Democrat, New Deal, now he's creating what he'll call the Fair Deal. One of the linchpins of his support is, of course, organized labor. And so what has Harry Truman got to do? Well, what Harry Truman is going to do is get royally pissed off. He tells his advisors that this can't stand. He's trying to get the railroad workers to go back to work. They are refusing. So he's going to go before Congress, give a joint address to Congress, and demand the authority from Congress. He wants a law passed so that he can draft all the striking rail workers into the Army. That's a little what? Oh, I'm passes, I'm wandering too much. I'm a walker, forgive
I
me.
know.
Let's draft them into the army if they won't go back to work. Now, he has an attorney general, a man named Tom Clark. Tom Clark will go on to serve many years on the U.S. Supreme Court, but right now he's Harry Truman's attorney general, and he questioned the constitutionality. Said, Mr. President, maybe this is not constitutional. Truman got mad at Tom Clark and said, we'll draft him first and think about the law later. So he did, and in the meantime, U.S. seizes rails. Did you all realize that we actually did this in this country? We once seized the rails during the strike. I see some yeses and nos. And he went before Congress, gave the speech that most of his cabinet and his attorney general specifically told him not to give. And the House of Representatives, always the bedrock of American constitutional guarantees, passes Truman's request to draft the strike workers 306 to 13. 306 to 13. Kind of remarkable. In the Senate, however, Truman's proposal dies. And you have a strange coalition, or unusual coalition. Liberal Democrats don't like it because they are pro-labor union, and conservative Republicans don't like it because they don't like Harry Truman, and they think it's unconstitutional. So after convincing Truman and his supporters in the Congress that if you admit workers, if you take workers on strike and you induct them involuntarily into the army, and then they resist that, what are they? You gotta regard them legally as traitors. You gotta court-martial them. One Republican senator said, are we gonna impose a death penalty or a penitentiary on the strikers who won't go into the army or who go AWOL? And so finally, this coalition of conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats, come to their senses and reject Truman's request and say, you know, maybe this effort is going a little too far. Yes.
What year was this again?
This was 1946. 1946. 1946 is also a year that we're dealing with mounting inflation. Truman in January, in his State of the Union address to Congress, had asked Congress to extend price control legislation, said he wanted it on his desk by April the 1st, to be extension of wartime price controls with some modifications. He didn't get it until the end of June 1946. And then it was so badly written that Truman's head of the Office of Economic Stabilization, Chester Bowles, resigned in protest. He said, I cannot remain here to administer the inflationary bill which Congress presented to your signature, he tells the president. So what's Truman to do? If he signs the measure, he can be expected to constrain inflation without really the proper mechanisms or ability to do that. If he doesn't sign it, prices may explode further on the expiration of the current law in June of 46. So he vetoes it. And here you see President Truman See, the Office of Price Administration bill portrayed as being approached by a snake, being cut in two by President Truman. Just as he had predicted, Truman, by vetoing the bill, what followed was in fact, in lifting all government price controls, what followed in 46, in the fall and winter of 46, was out of control inflation. In the next 2 weeks after this veto, prices in this country rose on the essential measurements in an inflationary rate, rose more than it had in 1 month, in 2 weeks, more than it had in the previous 3 years. Wholesale prices within days of the veto soared to heights that had not been seen since 1920. There were unheard of record price increases in butter, coffee, and a whole array of foodstuffs. Finally, Congress passed a sort of a compromise bill, quasi-price controls, July of 46, and Truman, with reluctance, he says, signs it. To wrap it up, a friendly biographer of Harry Truman, looking back after his presidency, Alonzo Hamby, he's a biographer who wrote, again, a very favorable, overall favorable book about the Truman presidency. Even in that book, he writes, Truman's performance was terrible in 1946. He appeared to have danced around every side of the issue. He was weak, then he was strong, then he was weak again. On July 26th, 46, Time Magazine's congressional correspondent, a man who'd be around for many years, named Frank McNaughton, wrote in an internal memo to Henry Luce, Harry Truman could not carry Missouri today. And again, what hindered Truman? Place was running 15% annually in the late 40s. The shortages, everything we've talked about as you reconvert to a peacetime economy, trouble converting factories, including with the strikes, labor unrest. I'll come back to the Marshall Plan later. Dixiecrats, we haven't even talked about that. Southern Democrats were not too fond of either FDR in his later years or of Truman because he wanted to promote civil rights for black people. South is still segregated. He's often portrayed in the press as being too weak for the presidency, meaning, well, he's no FDR. You always get compared. And there were a lot of very pithy statements. One of the funniest is the expression was used throughout the 1946 off-year congressional campaign, to err is Truman. Err is Truman. His campaign song had been, I'm just wild about Harry. And so he began to see signs, bumper stickers that said, I'm just mild about Harry. And again, meat prices remained out of control in 46 into 47. Stockmen refused to send their cattle to packing houses because of price controls that still stood on meat. Tens of thousands of butchers, Jim, across America closed their shops. And from Albuquerque to Miami, customers in search of meat actually rioted. This is a picture of standing in line, long lines, to buy meat. not the kind of picture you want to see if you're running for election in 1946.
Jim,
Yes.
was meat still rationed during this?
Meat was still rationed, yeah. Meat, there had been some modification in the revitalized bill, or remodel bill that had been signed in July, but meat was still rationed, which was why the butchers were unhappy, the processors were unhappy, groceries were unhappy. It became a national obsession in the press, and I include radio as well as newspapers, lamenting that we were about to have a meat famine. And again, when you think about these reactions, remember, we're dealing with an audience that by and large has vivid memories of the Great Depression. This is only 1946. The weird cry of "we want meat," wrote Collier's Weekly columnist Tom Stokes, seemed as one heard it to symbolize the desire for all things material that we couldn't get. The demand for hamburger reflected more than the greed, however, of spoiled Americans. Although in Europe it kind of looked that way when you have the specter of hunger and starvation throughout Europe. The better.
Oh, I was thinking break.
Okay, in a moment I will. The meat protests in America look a little self-absorbed to some Europeans. It's also reflected in a kind of an increasingly general feeling that government cannot cope. Come what may, wrote John McConnell, political columnist for the New York Daily News, this battle for the control of Congress, remember 46 is an off-year congressional election, will go down in our political history and will be known as the meat campaign. One more thing, and then we'll take our halfway break. October 24th, 1946. You know, the election is in November. Harry Truman's approval rating is down to 32%. He tells reporters that controls are indispensable, price controls remain indispensable, and that night he gives a speech supposed to be on the topic of price controls, give them more time, they'll eventually work. He gives a speech on radio that night. This is the second largest audience that had ever tuned in to hear Truman speak, the largest being when he announced that the war was over. So everybody tunes in, and Truman again is annoyed. And he lashes out at, quote, the few men in Congress who in the service of selfish interests have been determined for some time to wreck price controls, no matter what the cost may be to our people. Not exactly a fig leaf. What is it? Why, Mr. Truman, that's a portrait of controls you commissioned me to do. Guess I don't understand modern art. Then in the same speech, Truman announces, this is October 46, that he's going to lift the price controls on meat after all. And that even though he thinks it's a bad idea, he's hearing public opinion, he's seeing the lines, he's going to lift them. The next day, the New York Daily News headline is, and this is a classic, prices soar, buyers soar, steers jump over the moon. Brickbats are flying at the president after his address. Brothers at Ohio's Clarence Brown, chairman of the Republican Congressional Committee, the tide is sweeping our way. Even then they're talking about a red tide. And a couple more things and I'll stop. I mentioned the jibes, a couple besides the air is Truman, and I'm just wild about Harry. Another one that you heard a lot on the campaign trail from Republicans was, why had the president been late to today's press conference? The joke went. He got up this morning a little late, stiffened the joints, and had trouble putting his foot in his mouth. And with that, let's take a quick 5-minute break and we'll resume.
Like 10.
So, what was the justification